And here is the class, Astronomy 240, or History of Science 240, and we're glad to hear from you.
Let's go around the table very quickly. You can tell me your name, but I'll promptly forget that. Tell me what your concentration is, your major.
I'm Mac. I'm English and Economics double major.
I'm Ariana, history and ethics.
I'm Maggie, I do chemistry and English.
I'm Kristen. I'm a freshman, so I haven't declared, but probably English.
I'm Elba, I'm a sophomore in American Studies. I'm Alanis, I'm a sophomore in English.
I'm Ethan, I'm a sophomore. I'm undeclared, but probably mathematics.
I'm Brendan, I'm a senior, and I'm majoring in astronomy and economics.
I'm Tom, I'm a senior, I'm majoring in theater and English.
I'm Andrew, I'm a senior, I'm majoring in history and French.
I'm William, I'm a freshman, and I'll probably be majoring in math.
I'm Zoe, I'm a senior, and I'm studying political science and history.
I will. I'll probably major in history.
We're friends of Jay's.
We're real seniors.
I got interested in Copernicus in particular because as a youth I had a remarkable opportunity just at the end of World War II to be a cowboy on a horse ship carrying 800 horses to Poland, which was a war-torn country, needed the horsepower, one might say, for the farming. And so I had an opportunity to return to Poland many years later when the historians of science on an international basis were having their triennial meeting in Poland. And I went there and I soon discovered something that I should have realized, that at a crucial time in the historiography of Copernicus, namely the anniversary of when he had written his great book, De Revolutionibus, was a time when Poland was under German occupation. And the Germans believed that no Pole could possibly be clever enough to have thought up this whole heliocentric system. And so there were immense number of papers of various sorts to prove that Copernicus was a Pole. We take an advance hid by more than a decade. Poland is now a free country, but suffering a great deal from the terrors of war. But determined when the next anniversary for Copernicus was coming up, there would be a grand Polish celebration. And so I got caught up in that and became one of the organizers for the celebrations. Now it seemed to me that there was a certain problem. Copernicus had been studied for so long that it's hard to imagine you'd get anything new about Copernicus. And I knew I would be asked to speak, and I was scratching my head, what could I possibly talk about? But in the process of looking around, I found a copy of Copernicus's book in Edinburgh at the Scottish Royal Observatory. And this book was heavily annotated. And I wondered who could have annotated this book. But the more I studied the annotations, the more I realized that they were probably made by Erasmus Reinhold, a professor in Germany at the time that Copernicus's book came out, and that one saw in the annotations somebody wrestling with it, and Then I discovered subsequently other copies of these notes which had been copied by students. So there was a whole system of remarks this way. I became more and more intrigued by this because I realized that, wait a minute, I'm going to have something to say about Copernicus when the anniversary itself rolls around. So I got started looking at all possible copies of Copernicus's book. And that's not an easy thing to do, because if you want to locate a few copies of something, there are all sorts of finding aids which are useful for something like this. But if you want to find all of the copies, that's a lot harder. It takes some ingenuity to figure out where they might be and to check up, go and see them. And eventually I saw just about 600 copies of either the first edition, which came out at the end of Copernicus's lifetime in 1533, or the second edition, which came out in 1566. And these were eventually put into a book. I gave it the title, The Book Nobody Read. Not that I believed that title, quite on the contrary. But Arthur Koestler, a famous German author, was upset that German schoolboys knew the name of Galileo, but not necessarily Kepler, who was a German astronomer also. And he wrote a book entitled, the main section of it, The Book Nobody Read. And after finding out a lot about readers of the book, I wrote my own book entitled The Book Nobody Read. Here is a copy of it. There was a lot of exciting detective work, which I have not time to tell you about this afternoon. But I wanted to read a particular section that gives you an idea of some of the things that were going on. I'd love to read you the whole chapter, but I don't have time to do that. I'll just pick up a few things from the epilogue of the book. What's going on here? The inquisitor was Don Goldsmith, a confidant and sometime intellectual sparring partner. He had unexpectedly arrived from Berkeley one afternoon in 2000, just as two previous visitors were leaving my office. "Oh," I said, playing dumb, "why do you think anything special is going on?" "Well, your ordinary academic visitors don't have revolvers bulging in their pockets." Discretion was the order of the day, so I could only hint at the circumstances. He had surmised correctly that the FBI had paid a call, and he undoubtedly suspected it had something to do with rare books, and probably with Copernicus, but I couldn't reveal the details just then. It goes on to talk about some thefts from major European libraries, and people were on the trail of this. I'm going to skip ahead and explain to you, in part, why the book is entitled The Book Nobody Read. It's used sarcastically because, as it says in the I thought it was in the back right there. I said, Copernicus's book, clearly when Arthur Kessler wrote that De Revolutionibus was a book that nobody read and was an all-time worst seller, he couldn't have been more mistaken. He was wrong, dead wrong. My publisher said, you don't have to say it twice. And I said, I don't want anybody to be left in doubt. So it's that way. Let me pick it up a little bit later in the church, in the final chapter. In 1974, I had undertaken a field expedition to a series of provincial libraries in Italy, including the Biblioteca Palatina in Parma. There I saw a second edition of De Revolutionibus, but unfortunately, its first edition was nowhere to be found. The librarian even showed me a gap on the shelf where it was supposed to be. I assumed that the volume was simply in use in some library office and gave it no further thought. Sometime later, when I happened to tell Robert Westman, one of my colleagues on the West Coast, about the missing book, he remarked that, curiously enough, it had been missing when he tried to see it a year earlier than I. This information aroused my interest in the book, so I wrote to the library asking for the description of the volume as it appeared in their catalog. My vague memory was that the catalog had mistakenly attributed to Andreas Osiander the introduction to this great 16th century, introduced to this 16th century classicist, Joachim Camerarius. When the description arrived, I realized that I had hastily misread it when I had visited Parma. What the caption actually indicated was that the volume was prefaced by a Greek manuscript poem in the hand of Camerarius, a German scholar of the 16th century. I knew of one book, undoubtedly the most fabulous copy in private hands, that matched this description. It had turned up mysteriously in the London book market shortly after World War II. Could that copy have been liberated by an Allied soldier or by a hungry librarian? Because its then current owner, the extraordinary collector Haven O'More, lived part of the year in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I asked him if he would bring the precious book to my office at the observatory. When he did, one afternoon in March 1981, we took it to a dark closet and inspected it with ultraviolet light. The rag paper used in the 16th century editions glows under ultraviolet, except where ink has been applied. And the writing will still show clearly in contrast to the glowing paper. Similarly, the glue marks from the removed labels revealed themselves in telltale traces, but there were none. The book with the Camerarius manuscript poem appeared to have a clean bill of health. No identifying ownership marks had been erased or washed out. Nonetheless, Because the description in the Palatina catalog seemed a perfect match, I was prepared to link the book brought to my office with the missing copy. An unexpected episode a few years later taught me to be more cautious in making such inferences. Pierre Barres, an eminent French dealer, informed me that he had something of interest concerning Copernicus. When I had occasion to go to Paris, I arranged a visit. Barres then related the following curious tale. An anonymous caller, possibly Italian, had inquired by phone if Barres was interested in some old books, including a first edition of the Revolutionibus. When an affirmative reply was forthcoming, the mystery voice said, "You can't contact us. We'll get in touch with you." Some days later, Barres explained, a packet of photocopies arrived without a return address. The sheets were mostly copies of title pages, but with that of Copernicus's book were two xerographic copies recording a Greek manuscript poem, and these he produced for me. I saw at once here was another copy of Camerarius's poem, which was in the Horblick copy that I had looked at, but which didn't have any marks additional that would somehow place it there in Italy. So I explained the situation at Biblioteca Palatina. "This is surely the stolen Palatina copy," Barres quickly concluded, and he declared he would abandon the pursuit of the book. With that, the tale went cold, leaving me with a troubling dilemma, whether to publish the photocopies in my census to alert possible buyers to a stolen copy, or to suppress this information lest the thief simply destroy the identifying sheet, which was a page of a Greek poem in the back of it. After a decade passed, and before I had to make the final decision, the book prefaced with the Camerarius manuscript surfaced once again. This time, a New York dealer had caught wind of its existence and promptly alerted me. Again, I said, "On guard." A few weeks later, I was telephoned by an expert at Sotheby's in Milan. The Copernicus volume, unbound and in a somewhat disreputable state, had been brought to the auction house by a family in Parma. The book had been acquired from the father, since deceased, who had a reputation as a local bibliophile, and who apparently did not raise questions about the sources of the books offered to him. What evidence did I have that the voice from Milan inquired that the book belonged to the Palatina? I explained with the catalog description about it. Apparently, I had had access to a special catalog, not the public one. For my information was news to Sotheby's representative, who nevertheless reported that he had investigated and discovered that most, if not all, the books being offered to Sotheby's were listed in the Palatina catalog, but were in fact missing from the shelves. There, the matter rested for several months, and then in January 2000, I received an email stating simply, "Nicholas is back in the Biblioteca Palatina." I'm not sure precisely how this happened, but it was a fitting conclusion to the dogged, adventurous, almost quixotic 30-year pursuit into the way the 16th century astronomers reacted to the most revolutionary scientific advance in more than a millennium. That's how I had to end it when the book was going to press. But eventually, I received a simple message from one of the Italian book dealers it said simply, Nicholas is back in the Palatino. So I went to Parma to see this copy, and the faces of the librarians were very long. And they said, the book is not here. It's under litigation. Well, I was very indignant because it was so obvious that the book belonged in that library. And I said as much. And the next message I got was indicated that the litigation had been finished, and it was agreed that the book and the whole group of books which had been brought to the auction house were stolen, and they were returned to the library. So when I went back, you can imagine what a joyful reception I received in the library, because they realized that it was my stubbornness that had brought the collection of books back to them. Well, it was exciting for me to look at the book, because the book was richly annotated. And I realized in looking at it that the annotations were made by Joachim Redicus, the number 2 person who had helped Copernicus get the book ready for the press. And without his assistance, Copernicus, who was growing very old, would probably never have got his book published. And I wondered, how did this book from the inside circle of Copernicus end up in Italy? The title page was filled with annotations, but so badly smeared that there was only one word that I could read in the entire page. It said Hieronimo, which is the Latin for Jerome. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute. There's an important figure named Jerome in this whole story. This is Jerome Cardano, one of the most important mathematicians of the 15th century. And when Redicus made sort of an investigatory trip to Italy after the book was published, he had gone to Milan, where Cardano was living, and actually stayed with Cardano for a number of weeks. And so, as far as I could tell, this was one of Redicus's personal copies of the inside circle of getting the Copernicus book published. So I was very delighted to realize that things were all falling together. And it's now safe there. This is not the copy of Copernicus's book stolen from Parma. It is one which I purchased all fair and square, but I realized then that the book has, here it is, Copernicus's De Revolutionibus. It is not a first edition of the book. I can explain why I don't have a first edition of the book. One of the copies recently sold went for $5 million. Copies that have been advertised at auction have sold since then for $3 million and for $2 million. So they're in a pricey world. This is a second edition, which is much cheaper, but it is an unusual copy. For at the back of the book, there are annotations which were made by, were copies of the ones that I had seen in Parma. So we don't know for sure who made the copies, but there are typographical errors on this particular page. Some of the columns of this table have been out of place in the print. And at the bottom of the page, you can see the annotations which are correcting what is in those columns. So I have found a second copy like this, but the way in which the corrections are made, I'm convinced that this is the original copy as it works out from Reticus's copy that was given to Cardano and is now in Parma. So I wanted to show you this. And Jay, why don't you show your first edition? I've set you up in a very vulnerable position because who knows what.
Well, I've known Professor Gingerich since before he was a historian of astronomy, so when he was doing stellar atmospheres calculations at the Smithsonian Astrophysics Observatory and the Harvard Observatory when I was a freshman when I started. And eventually we went through the story of, that you heard from him about, this was after he was a cowboy, but before the Copernicus quadricentennial. And in any case, you've seen my Dialogo from Galileo, and then a couple of years later, I called him or wrote him and said, well, I really would like a Copernicus. How do I do that? And he wrote me back eventually that he looked around the world. There were 2 copies he knew of, one in Germany, one in Japan, and I asked him which he recommended. So I recognized the cover of the Blind Staff Calf, and I got the book. I corresponded with a person in Germany about it, and a couple of months later it arrived in the regular mail, just wrapped up like a parcel. The copy of this Copernicus, it's a relatively clean copy, which some of us might think is desirable, but that's exactly what Professor Gingerich does not like to see, because he studied the annotations in hundreds of copies, and you've seen this book already, and I like to make the point that it wasn't that Copernicus woke up in the morning and said, "Oh yes, let's put the sun at the center," but rather he has all kinds of measurements and calculations, and maybe we'll get Professor Gingerich to talk a little more about just what Copernicus did, because he was not a big observer. He wasn't making all the telescope things himself. He was calculating, but this very intricate stuff. Although if it's based, Owen, on all these calculations, why is the heliocentric diagram on folio 10 instead of at the end after all the calculations? Well, but in any case, you've seen this copy, and we'll have it here. Now, Mr. Chapin, who gave the books to the library, to found the Chapin Library here, had a copy of the Copernicus first edition, that,
Some of you were looking at it last
that
week.
we've had out, yeah.
And we noticed that it's a less tall copy, as we say in the trade, meaning it's more heavily trimmed. It is a later binding. It's only half. Then we've had it repaired because the cover was coming off. But this, as again was noticed last time, does have a certain amount of underlining, different places. So it has been read. At least the first part has been read. You get into the calculations, well, maybe not. And you can flip through the later parts and you don't find any underlying. So at least somebody was interested in the introductory material. Mr. Chapin also was able to get a second edition. This is 1543, this is from 1566. And this has been reset. And it's interesting to see that it has come back and is still of interest enough that a printer is going to spend the money to, the capital expense of paper and type to produce another copy.
Remember, this is all individual letters and type, so they printed a few pages at a time, and then they broke down the pages and printed a few more pages. So to do a second edition, we started from scratch.
These were both, the first edition is published in Nuremberg, but this edition is published in Basel.
So at the moment, we have 2 first editions and 2 second editions of the Copernicus out for you to see. And, you want to come up and look at it for a few minutes? Let's take 5 minutes and then go back to Professor Gingerich. And you could look through his census of some 600 plus copies of the first and the second editions. I'll open to the page for Williamstown, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, and so here on page 326, we see second edition, Roman numeral 2, from the collection of Owen Gingerich. We find another entry for a second edition that says disbound, but formerly old vellum, somewhat worn, much fox. How incomplete is it? Do you have wherever he is? Is he sitting down? Oh, there he is. So do you have almost 2 second editions or 1 3/4 second editions?
No, I have 1 complete second edition.
And this other copy of disbound pages.
That's a first edition.
Oh, well. Anyway, it says no annotations. And then there were 2 copies, 250 and 254. Well, first, one second. The Williams College Chapin Library, and the next page is 251. Williamstown 3, Massachusetts collection of J. Pasachoff over here. Roll stamped pigskin. They're blue Galford edges. And something about the provenance, old shelf bark, scattered underlining, and small notes on certain pages. And so and there were some Smithsonian funds from agriculture, was it, that allowed you to see some more of these copies? Is that correct story?
Toward the end of World War II, the U.S. had typically huge surpluses of grain stored away in silos all through the Midwest. What to do with this? A public law was passed by Congress that these grains should be sent to Europe or India, which desperately needed the grains. And the idea was that the money, the payment for it, would not be taken away from the country, that it would be there for research purposes and so on. So that I was able to tap those funds and get money which I was able to use for travel. Because in Warsaw, both Pan Am and TWA had offices selling airline tickets. And they could be purchased there and could get me to the various places in Europe where I wanted to search for books. So I ask you to move around a little so that the people standing in the back can get close enough to smell the books.
Here we go.
The other two books are not Copernicus, they're for Kepler.
We'll get to them, the Keplers.
Will we be able to take the books to the second venue this afternoon?
Mine or yours?
Some of yours?
You can take yours anywhere you want.
Sure.
Well, I've been to a lot of libraries, and many of the libraries are not so generous in laying their books out on a table for you to look at this way. But when you're obviously serious about wanting to get the information from the books and what's written on different pages, most libraries are very generous and cooperative.
So maybe in a couple of minutes, we'll go back to the table and hear more from Professor Gingerich, and he can explain why he brought in Rudolphine tables and why he asked that my copy of the 1596 book, my Kepler, be available with us.
Yeah, so good try.
And Owen, Owen, I did not buy the book from the person in Japan. Do you know what happened to it?
I'd have to look in the census volume.
Well, but if it was sold, it would be under the current person.
The current person when the census was
Was published.
That's all I hear.
Yeah.
I guess he's just saying the word.
What we need is to digitize it all so you can do a word search, and then we can search for Japan.
No, that's not right. Zeros.
Okay, let me send you back to.
Yeah, let's go back to theirs.
I'm now going to turn away from Copernicus. He published some minor things, but not very many books. And he wouldn't have ever got the De Revolutionibus done without this young scholar from Wittenberg coming to encourage him. So I'm going to now move to an intermediary personality, because I want to talk to you about Tycho Brahe without showing you a Tycho Brahe book, but something else that will help you understand what a tremendous figure Tycho Brahe was. Some of you have heard of him. He was the astronomer who lost the middle part of his nose in a duel during a drunken birthday celebration. Some relative gave him a whack. He replaced it with a silver prosthetic. That's the only thing that many people know about him. But he was a member of the royalty in Denmark, which means he had access to a huge number of funding. And he got interested in astronomy even from a young teenager. And when he then had the opportunity and the funding, he began to build instruments because he wanted to get positions of stars. If you wanted to take Copernicus's book to the next step beyond that, you have to have observations. That is the holdup. So his observations were printed in various books, scattered around and so on, but he did a tremendous advance of getting the machinery, the instruments, so he could measure the positions of the planets over a period of time. They move slowly throughout the sky. Saturn takes 30 years to get around once. Jupiter about 12 years, and so on. Now, Tycho is dead, but his observations are available in Denmark. A Jesuit comes along and decides he wants to make a book of all the observations, not just by Tycho Brahe, but about anybody else that he can find observing. Now, there were observations being made during the Islamic period, during the Greek period by Ptolemy. Ptolemy gives a minimum number of observations needed to get the rhythm of the planet going so that he can work out any time of past or future. Here's the Jesuit book. It's published under a pseudonym. The Catholic Church was a little bit nervous about giving too much credit to Tycho Brahe because he was Lutheran. And so it is here. And I want to show you something about I'll just open it. It's sort of at random. You can see the book is filled with huge numbers of numbers. It's a book of observations. Now, let me go near the beginning of the book. Here's a picture of an instrument. This instrument was humongous. There's a guy standing next to it. Can you see him over here? It was so big that it was unsuccessful. You couldn't keep track of moving it smoothly and getting the positions. So that instrument made in Germany taught him that he had to do it some other way. So in order to get sufficient information, he had to work on other instruments that were much, much larger. So he had essentially an instrument building factory there on his island in the straits between Denmark and Sweden. Now, these pages represent all the observations that he could find. He didn't do too well on the Islamic observations. But the amazing thing is, there aren't all that many observations from the Islamic period. When you start to look for them, you find they're very thin on the ground. These are the observations made by Tycho Brahe from the late 1500s up to the time of his death, about 1600. That's a lot of observations. Did you understand what I meant? These are recording all the Tycho Brahe observations, and these are all of the observations that the author could find prior to Tycho Brahe. I don't know of any better way than this particular book to show you the impact that Tycho Brahe made with his observations. Unfortunately, some young man came looking for a job, and that was Johannes Kepler. And it was Kepler who then was able to mine these observations and use a little bit. These are observations from the next 20 to 30 years after Tycho Brahe died. So you notice he got something going, the likes of which was not carried on. But it was a registry of observations that made it possible for Kepler to work. It's a heavy book to bring down.
And he paid himself to publish that book. Did he?
He set up his own paper factory. His island was above the water line, so that where the water ran off the top of the island into the ocean, he could have a mill to stir up the paper. The pulp was going to go into the paper.
But who would have bought a copy of the book except for himself?
I don't know, because the reprints that were made the following year, because there were apparently not enough available that he had printed himself. It was very popular to be able to get those books for your library.
Okay. The books nobody read.
Listen, there was Kepler. After 10 months, Tycho Brahe died, and Kepler inherited the whole works. There were Tycho Brahe's heirs who were extremely jealous of what Kepler was doing, because Kepler was a Copernican, and Tycho Brahe didn't believe in the motion of the Earth. And so Kepler went off in another kind of direction. I want to talk a little bit about Kepler and his publications. I think I want to, someplace here is Kepler's.
The Cosmographica is this little book here. That's the beautiful book.
That's why don't we just open up this most famous.
No.
It's, there are two together, probably. Yes,
That's
here.
I think we don't want to pick it up because of possible tearing. If you stand up, you can probably see a little bit of it.
I'm going to ask you to walk past this, but wait a minute. This book is printed when Kepler was 23 years old. So this is his first important book. I'm going to ask people to be able to walk around it so we can turn it this way. Now, I brought my own copy. I think I've forgotten to bring my own copy. I knew I was getting in a hurry. But we have the other one.
We have the Godot tables here.
No, you don't have the secondary one of this.
No, this is the only one we have.
I brought the Astronomy Nova by mistake because it is a much larger book. Now, wait a minute. This is the result of the tables. Oh, sorry. I think you have to get up and move now.
They need to see this.
I suggest they see this on their way out as they go to the other room.
Okay, well, we have another 15 minutes here.
Oh, you do? I thought you were going to split it at halfway mark. 20 years later, Kepler does this over again. And it would be fun to show you the later edition of it. But I've forgotten to bring it.
We might find a copy on the web when we go to the other room, at least to see what it looks like.
What's interesting about it is that whoever was working on the second edition, now Kepler is big time stuff, working with the emperor, seeing him regularly, and so on. And he decides he had enough errors in this book, he wants to do it again. Whoever was doing it again took this page, which shows a possible arrangement of the spacing of the planets. He took a copy of this and pasted it down on the copper engraving, copper plate, and they made the new edition of it that way. The effect of that is that you get a mirror image when you take something like this, carve it into the copper plate, and then turn the plate up to print it. And it's fun to see the two patterns of this. But as I say, I blew it.
Is it inferior in detail because of the copying mechanism?
No, it's much more professionally done. The engraver is much more professional. Kepler is much higher reputation. This is something, as I say, done by a 23-year-old.
And the plate is lost, presumably.
Yes, but Kepler did not make the engraving. A specialist made the engraving. What you're seeing here is the Platonic solids. These are the solids you can get by making every face of the solid identical. So the spacer between the circles for Jupiter and Saturn are spaced apart in this scheme of things by a square. Then the distance from Saturn, from Jupiter to Mars is the largest proportional gap in the solar system. So how does Kepler get that? By using the octahedron, no, the tetrahedron. That is the four-sided figure with four vertices. It stretches it out the most. Kepler is very lucky in the way that this works. Otherwise, he couldn't have succeeded with it. He works it in the next pattern to get between Mars and the Earth. And you can see that it is a five-sided plate. The solid is made of these five-sided plates mapped together. Who knows what that figure is called? You get 12 figures.
Dodecahedron.
Yes, absolutely. It's dodecahedron. And so on down. It's very hard to see it there. Okay, I'll let you come in a few minutes to be able to look at that. He goes to work for Tycho Brahe, and I think just my holding this book up for you to see the dimensions of it, you realize that, wait a minute, this is 16:9, and it is quite more magnificent. Well, you know about where that comes from. If you take a look at the title page, and I have to hold it up anyway. You can see that the biggest print on this page is Rudolph II, the emperor with the money. So this is a very different story than this other little book.
You notice that Rudolph's name is a lot bigger than Kepler's, too.
Yes, that's right. I've always wished I could have a copy of this book. Back around 1990, this copy of the book came up for sale. And I said to myself, this is the key book for my own researches. I had better get it. So I sent off a check to Italy, but it was too late. Somebody else had bought it. He was the wealthiest man in northern Italy, and he was forming a collection of books, and money did not particularly stop him. Just a few years ago, he passed away, and his library went up for sale at Christie's in London, and Jay did his research and sent me an email saying, by the way, the Astronomy Nova, the name of this book, did not sell at the auction for reasons that are not at all clear. But I wrote to Christie's and said, how much do you really want for that book? And happily they sold it to me at the lowest